Welcome to The Middle. I'm Jeremy Hobson, along with our house DJ, Tolliver. And Tolliver, before we get into the show, I do want to say it has been a pretty crazy week for both of us. I have lived on and off in Los Angeles since I was an NPR producer 20 years ago, and this week had to suddenly evacuate because of one of the fires that started very close to my home. Thankfully, we are safe, no damage. A lot of people not as lucky. How are you doing?
I'm good, man. I'm thankful to be safe over here in K-Town where there's not a lot of damage. Just trying to, maintain and entertain my cats because they have no idea what's going on.
Right. I know my dog, actually, I feel like he can tell that there's like the sky is smoky, the air is smoky. I do want to thank everyone for checking in on us. It is very hard to see so much devastation in this city that I love, but it is truly heartening to see so many people taking care of each other as they do everywhere in this country during disasters like this. And for the record, Tolliver, both you and I grew up in Illinois, Tornado Alley. I will say this is way scarier than a tornado.
Yeah, the visuals are intense.
It is.
Very different.
Well, now to our topic this hour, a very important topic. What should happen now with Ukraine and what's at stake for the United States? We are getting very close to the inauguration of President-elect Donald Trump, who has said multiple times that he would end the war within 24 hours of becoming president. Here he is in a town hall with CNN's Caitlin Collins.
If I'm president, I will have that war settled in one day, 24 hours.
How would you settle that war in one day?
Because I'll meet with Putin, I'll meet with Zelensky. They both have weaknesses and they both have strengths. And within 24 hours, that war will be settled. It'll be over. It'll be absolutely over.
Do you want Ukraine to win this war?
I don't think in terms of winning and losing. I think in terms of getting it settled so we stop killing all these people and breaking down this country.
Under President Biden, the U.S. has been a staunch supporter of Ukraine in their ongoing conflict with Russia, supplying the nation with billions of dollars in foreign aid and military assistance ever since Russia invaded in 2022. Trump, on the other hand, hasn't made clear what he wants to see happen other than an end to the war. So we want to hear from you. What should happen now with Ukraine and what's at stake for the United States? Tolliver, can you give everybody the number, please?
Yeah, it's 8444-MIDDLE. That's 844-464-3353. Or you can write to us at listentothemiddle.com. And you can also comment on our new live stream on YouTube, TikTok, and Twitch.
Let's meet our panel. Fox News Chief National Security Correspondent Jennifer Griffin is with us. Jennifer, welcome to The Middle.
Thank you, Jeremy. Glad to be here.
And Dan Baer, who is the director of the Europe program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, is a former U.S. ambassador to the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. His book is called The Four Tests. Dan, welcome to you.
Thanks so much. I'm pleased to be here.
Well, before we get to the phones, Jennifer, you've been covering this very closely. Just give our listeners a sense of what is going on with the war right now. It does seem like it's been kind of in a back and forth stalemate for quite some time.
Well, I think, Jeremy, first of all, I've been covering the war since the night that Russia invaded. We were briefed at the Pentagon in the days leading up to the war of what to expect. The administration took an incredible decision to declassify that intelligence. It was the same intelligence that was shared with Vladimir Zelensky and his team. And so we knew what was coming. We were watching it in real time, and I've been covering it really ever since. I was in Ukraine after the Bucha massacre, a few months after the Russians invaded. And I think the way to think about this right now, in terms of what a sort of stalemate they're in, but in terms of the amount of destruction is incredible. We just heard from Defense Secretary Austin today that Russia has 700,000 casualties, if you include the dead and wounded. That is an incredible number for the last 3 years. But the way to think of this is, if you looked at a map of Ukraine, you would see that the Russians have really been they control right now about 20% of Ukraine, but they've been moving forward at a rate of just about 1 mile a month. So that means that really they're, in the last year,
it would take forever. It would take forever for them to get the
10 miles. So
right.
It's right now pretty stalemated. It's still pretty bloody. And I can say more about, the style of warfare, but I'll throw it back to you.
Yeah. Well, Dan Baer, what's your sense? And is there any way, do you think, for either side to win without an agreement and a negotiation?
In the near to medium term, there's no prospect, I think, of a serious breakthrough on either side if the status quo obtains. And as Jennifer said, the Russians are creeping forward, but very slowly, and actually slower probably because of the winter weather. And that will stay slow likely during the spring because as things thaw, there will be more mud, and that will slow things down as well. Both sides are really suffering from manpower issues, particularly the Ukrainians, but both sides. And just to put that number that Jennifer put out there in context, 700,000 Russians is probably 1.5% of the adult male military fighting age Russians in the country. That's a staggering number. It would be millions in the United States, the equivalent number. Ukraine is also really suffering from manpower challenges, and so they are both at a stalemate and also both feeling the hurt right now. And in addition to manpower, also on the equipment side, the Russians are sending mainly refurbed Soviet equipment to the front lines. They have some more of that to work through, but they will run out of that at some point. They're burning through it faster than they can make new kit. And the Ukrainians are obviously highly dependent on the assistance that they are getting from the United States and 49 other countries in that assistance group.
Well, and in terms of that assistance, Jennifer Griffin, do you have a sense of what Trump plans to do when he comes into office with this?
Well, I'm not sure Trump knows what he's going to do when he comes in, because already we've seen him shift the timeline of when he's going to resolve this conflict. He said 24 hours to Caitlin Collins, but just last week he said it'll probably take about 6 months. And then we heard Keith Kellogg, who is his special envoy to Ukraine, say on Fox News just this week that it would take about 100 days. So they're all over the map in terms of timing. I think what's clear in terms of his choice of national security advisor with Mike Waltz, who's a former Army Ranger and who understands the Ukraine situation and is not part of the isolationist wing of the party, and Keith Kellogg, a 3-star Army general, retired Army general. I think he is serious about engaging. I would expect that they are going to try to escalate before they try to get Putin and Zelensky to the negotiating table. The Biden administration is leaving about $4 billion in military aid that was passed by Congress last April. That wasn't their plan, but there is still $4 billion in military aid that the Trump administration can send weapons that are badly needed right now by Ukraine. Today, the Biden administration did announce another $500 million when Lloyd Austin was in Germany at the contact group meeting.
Let's go to the phones because the calls are coming in. Steve is in Denver, Colorado. Steve, welcome to the middle. What do you want to happen with Ukraine and the United States?
Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Go ahead.
Great. My concern is American values and what we stand for. And Russia has invaded a sovereign country and is trying to take it over by military force. As the democracy I think we are, that's not something that we just let happen, and there's all sorts that you guys already know about in terms of the potential down the road of what could happen in Europe as Russia feels like it can do such things, let alone China. So, number one, as a democracy, we need to defend Ukraine. And number two is if we don't want to see American boots on the ground, then we need to do everything we can to support Ukraine to maintain the sovereignty of their own borders.
At any cost, Steve?
And then, what do you mean, at a financial cost?
Yeah.
Pretty much, I would say yes. I would rather enormous financial cost than lose American soldiers in this war, or to have Russia feel like it can invade its neighbors in Europe, and what's that going to lead to down the road?
Right.
Sooner or later, we're going to have American boots on the ground in Europe if this doesn't stop.
Yeah. Steve, thank you very much for that call. Dan Baer, we've heard that from President Biden many times, saying that, if we don't stop this by supporting Ukraine to fight back against Russia, eventually the U.S. would be drawn into a larger war in Europe.
I mean, history over the last 120 years, we have seen that when countries try to change borders by force, particularly in Europe, sooner or later, America gets drawn in. And we never get drawn in because we want to jump in. World War I or in World War II, we didn't want to jump in. There were strong isolationist voices in the United States, but because eventually it implicates directly American interests, we get drawn in. And so I think the principle that countries should not be changing borders by force, that bullies don't get to decide that borders don't matter, is one that is not just a kind of nice principle to uphold, but it is one that history teaches us that when we don't uphold it, we get chaos, and that chaos has direct implications for Americans.
And Jennifer Griffin, what about Steve's point about just defending another democracy?
Well, it's a really important point, and I think it can't be understated that President Xi of China is watching. And if there's one bipartisan issue in Washington right now is concern about China's desire to overtake Taiwan in the next few years. And so if you want to deter President Xi from going into Taiwan, you really have to show that you're willing to stand up to bullies like Vladimir Putin. I think it's important to remember, Jeremy, that Vladimir Putin is hurting, and sometimes the U.S. is not very patient. And we need strategic patience right now because if you look at the ruble right now, it's lost half its value since this war began 3 years ago. The interest rates in Russia are 21%. They are bleeding money, and the sanctions are getting tightened. And you really don't know how, if the Ukrainians are willing to wait this out and keep fighting, then the U.S. should not pull the rug out from underneath them.
Mm-hmm.
Jeremy,
we're just stand by, Dan, because I want to get with you to the issue of the China-Taiwan situation, how that's connected. But Tolliver, the U.S. obviously has a lot of power here. Yeah. Europeans, though, probably have just as much, if not more, at stake.
Yeah, here's outgoing Belgian Prime Minister Alexander De Croo talking about European regional security in November.
We should be very clear on this. European security is not something that we outsource to someone else, for example, to the United States. But our security will be better if we work together. And we are open to discuss with the United States on how we can work better together. I hope we can, but of course we will also defend our own interests.
As we said, outgoing Prime Minister, a lot of politics being shaken in Europe as well because of what's happening there. A reminder, The Middle is available as a podcast in partnership with iHeart Podcasts on the iHeart app or wherever you listen to podcasts. And Tolliver, what are we listening to here?
This is Declan McKenna with British Bombs. While the song is not explicitly about Ukraine, its criticisms of endless weapons stockpiles are relevant to pretty much every conflict around the world. More of your calls coming up on The Middle.
This is The Middle. I'm Jeremy Hobson. If you're just tuning in, The Middle is a national call-in show. We are focused on elevating voices from the middle, geographically, politically, and philosophically, or maybe you just want to meet in the middle. This hour, we're asking you what should happen now with Ukraine. Tolliver, what is the number to call in?
It's 8444-MIDDLE. That's 844-464-3353. You can also write to us at listentothemiddle.com or on social media.
I'm joined by Fox News Chief National Security Correspondent Jennifer Griffin and former Ambassador Dan Baer, Director of the Europe Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Dan Baer, your book is called The Four Tests, What It Will Take to Keep America Strong and Good. And I wonder, what do you think is at stake when it comes to the future of American power with the war in Ukraine?
Well, I think the future of American power is going to involve a lot more working with other countries than perhaps we felt was necessary, say, in the 1990s when we were living through a unipolar moment. And in order to be able to build the kinds of partnerships and alliances that we're going to need to protect American prosperity and security in the coming years, we're going to need to have credibility in the world. We need to stand for something, and people are going to know that we stand for that when we say we stand for something, they can count on us. As the previous caller said, this is a moment when democracies are called to defend a fellow democracy against a brutal invasion without cause. And America's standing with Ukraine right now is not only standing up for our values, but demonstrating to the rest of the world that when we stand with you, we mean it. And I think that is important for our long-term credibility in the coming decades.
What about Russia, Jennifer Griffin? What is Putin's ultimate goal, especially all the losses you've talked about that Russia has taken in this war? What is an acceptable outcome for him at this point?
Well, Jeremy, I lived in Moscow in the late 90s from 96 to 99. And that is when Vladimir Putin was coming onto the scene. So I've been watching him for the last 30 years and really it's very clear that Putin is not going to back down. He's not going to pull out the Ukrainians. He's not going to suddenly say, "Oh, it was a mistake." He's not going to admit any weakness because that would be a problem for him back home. He will hold on to the 20% that he has. He's not going to negotiate on Crimea, and so the best way to protect Ukraine, and President Zelensky has said so, is he would like security guarantees if he does go to the table and agrees to stop the conflict and basically give up for the time being 20% of his country. He wants security guarantees and to be a part of NATO. One of the things that has been, that's something that President Trump has said is a red line. He doesn't believe that Ukraine should be in NATO. In fact, he's blamed that talk of being in NATO for why Putin invaded. I don't believe that is the case, having watched Putin for a long time. Putin is expansionist. He wants to get Ukraine back under his imperial designs on it. And it's important to remember that West Germany was made a part of NATO when East Germany was still occupied by Russia, so the Soviet Union at the time. So there is precedent for allowing a country in when there is still a conflict, and it prevents conflict from spreading, frankly.
Dan Baer, just on that point about NATO, do you think that is the key issue for Putin? If America and the Europeans said, okay, Ukraine is not getting into NATO, would that make enough of a difference, or does it not really matter?
No, I agree with Jennifer. His design is the full capitulation of Ukraine. He wants full control of all of Ukraine. And the reason he will stop is if the United States, Europe, and Ukraine all act together in order to show him that there is a wall and that he cannot have what he wants. The only way he'll stop is if he is made to believe that he cannot have what he wants. I agree with Jennifer that one of the key problems here to solve that the Trump administration will be tackling in the next 100 days is how to provide enough security guarantees to Ukraine so that once an agreement is signed, they can have confidence and we can have confidence and the Europeans can have confidence that it will stick. And that means that Putin has to believe that there's skin in the game for all of us if he violates that agreement down the road.
Let's go to Gregory, who's in Chicago. Gregory, welcome to The Middle. Go ahead.
Good evening. I attended the European Nuclear Disarmament Conference in March of 1983 when Reagan and Gorbachev were going back and forth about the Pershing II intermediate-range missiles being based in West Germany. Millions of people rose up, and the result was a détente in Iceland, in Reykjavik, between Gorbachev and Reagan, and the agreement that if he brought down the Iron Curtain and we ended the Cold War and the division of Germany left over from World War II and opened up Eastern Europe, that NATO would not expand 1 inch east of East Germany. Instead of abiding by that after the Warsaw Pact was dissolved and the Russian USSR collapsed, they have expanded NATO over the last 35 years to 16, 17 different countries. Mm-hmm. And the reason why it is unacceptable for the Russians to have Ukraine in NATO is because with hypersonic nuclear missiles being only 308 miles potentially from northeastern Ukraine to Moscow, it would destabilize the whole mutual assured destruction balance of power that has prevailed over the last 75 years of the nuclear Cold War age that we are still in. So therefore, what he wanted to do is to they wouldn't allow them to speak Russian in schools or in government. And so they wouldn't allow the Russians to have an autonomous region in the Donbass.
So Gregory, just briefly, what would you like to happen now?
The Ukrainians started the shelling, and they were going to go in and crush the Donbass. So Putin came in to protect the Donbass. He went overboard trying to take Kyiv. The treaty offering from the very beginning in February 2022 from the Putin administration is, let us just keep the 1,000-year-old Donbass with Russia. Right. You don't join NATO, and it's over.
Gregory, thank you for that. Jennifer Griffin, what's your response there to Gregory's thought about maybe they should have just accepted that in the first place?
Well, there's a few historical facts that I think are not correct in what Gregory said. The Ukrainians did not start the shelling against the Russian troops in the Donbass. The shelling began because the Russians had sent in what they called little green men who were provoking these kind of attacks because they were trying to stir up an uprising and an independence movement as an excuse for Putin to go in and send Russian troops in back in 2014. So that's what happened at the start of this. In terms of there is a way to structure this that Ukraine could be in NATO and not have nuclear weapons, for instance. Ukraine doesn't have nuclear weapons. So Putin fearing nuclear weapons on hypersonic missiles coming from Ukraine, that's fantasy. They don't have nuclear weapons. And there is precedent also if you look at Norway. Norway, when it joined NATO in 1949, it agreed not to allow nuclear weapons to be on its territory or to come into its ports. So there are plenty of ways to structure this so that Putin feels secure. The group that does not feel secure is Ukraine. They're the ones who've been invaded. And so we really have to remember who started this. And even if there was an excuse or a figment of Putin's imagination that NATO shouldn't have expanded into, NATO is not an aggressor. NATO is a defensive pact, and it was designed to protect, and it was desired by countries like Ukraine and the Baltic states who have been gobbled up in the past. They know their history, and this was their decision. It wasn't NATO demanding or invading those countries. Those countries came to NATO and asked to join. And frankly, Russia, when I was based in Russia, Russia had a seat for many years at NATO headquarters. In fact, they used it to spy on NATO, but they were given a seat there in good faith to try and keep the peace in Europe.
Jane is calling from Concord, Massachusetts. Jane, welcome to The Middle. Your thoughts about what should happen with Ukraine?
Hi. Well, I think if we look at what Trump said about Greenland recently, that we need it for our economic security, and then he says, for everybody else. He doesn't support NATO, so why would he use Greenland to help support Europe and everybody else? And I think we should have even been more aggressive against Putin in Ukraine from the very beginning, because it's been like little dribs and drabs here and there, adding weaponry and that sort of thing. And Putin needs to be stopped. It's a beginning of World War III, or at least a war for famine, because he wants to control agriculture in Ukraine. And I think Trump should be stopped from letting Putin have whatever he wants, because if Trump lets Putin have it, he'll let other strong men do whatever they want, all his buddies in North Korea and what have you.
Jane, thank you for that. Dan Bear, a way to stop World War III. We have heard that term thrown around a lot. I mean, what do you think about that from Jane?
Well, I first of all, I think we should wait and see what the Trump administration does. There's a lot of President-elect Trump says things a lot, and we should look at what they end up doing. He himself has said in recent weeks that you don't get to peace by abandoning Ukraine. I take encouragement from that he and General Kellogg and Mike Waltz are talking, and that they understand that there is a diplomatic and a security play to make here, that they're going to try to make here, but that they don't think it's a day one proposition anymore. So I think we should wait and see. I think there is a deal if the president-elect and his team can execute it. I think there is a deal that includes significant burden shifting so that the Europeans step up and do more. An agreement that the United States will not precipitously leave Europe or Ukraine out there hanging in exchange for the Europeans committing to step up and do more, and the security guarantees that Jennifer talked about. And if those things can be put together, that would be a deal in which President-elect Trump could say to the world, look, I've gotten de-escalation on the table, and I've gotten the Europeans to stand up and take more responsibility. And that is in the U.S. interest, and it's also a service in terms of putting de-escalation on a path. And so I think there's a possibility. I'd like to be hopeful right now. It's a dire conflict, but I think there's a possibility to look forward to a potential deal. And I think in that sense, really the most interesting near-term deal is the deal that President-elect Trump might make with the Europeans, not the deal that he might make with Putin.
What do you mean by that?
Well, I think the first conversations, if I they won't ask my advice, I suspect, but if I were offering advice, I would say, the first important conversations are going to be with Europeans about what they're ready to commit to in terms of building out their own industrial base, investing real money, which is going to mean solving their inability to raise money through debt. They're going to have to figure out a way to solve that. Investing real money in European defense, in being able to support Ukraine over the long haul. And in exchange for that, if they are willing to make that commitment, President Trump could offer that the United States will continue to offer support, declining over time, but we won't leave in a hurry. We'll continue to offer support. And then if we can solve the security guarantee piece, then you have a united front. You go to Putin and you're able to say, you're not going to break us apart. We are united here. Now is the time for you to sign a deal. And by the way, people will say that Putin can't deal with that because it would be construed as a loss. Putin was bragging about Syria being a win a few weeks ago. He can sell, he can sell anything. He can sell anything. If he can sell Syria as a win, he can sell a deal that is realistic and fair to Ukraine as a win at home as much as he needs to.
Tolliver, we have to go to you for some comments because we're live streaming for the first time.
Yeah.
What are people saying?
Yeah, John in St. Louis Park, Minnesota says, why are we only told by the media who the good and bad guys are in a conflict and never told any historical detail from both sides that would give us enough understanding to form a knowledgeable opinion? Jack in Madison, Wisconsin says, I personally am for unconditional aid to Ukraine. With that, my question is, how do we persuade the American public at large to continue to support Ukraine? Yeah. And then Jeff in Colorado says, just last one, sorry, Ukraine could just give up some of its territory and stop the war immediately. If there's a guarantee that Russia will not ever want any more of their territory or any other land or territory of any other country, it might be worth it.
I want to ask about that, the second one there, Jennifer Griffin, public support. It's very split. We're going to talk about between Republicans and Democrats. Democrats are much more supportive of Ukraine support than Republicans are at this point. But what about public support? How important is that in the United States in this question right now? Is Trump looking at the polls and saying, I'm representing the people that elected me?
Well, I think what's interesting is there's a lot of bipartisan support on the Hill. We saw that with the vote that took place last April. And those members of Congress are speaking to their constituents back home. I think there is a distorted picture that Americans are against this war, and that comes from a few loud voices on the internet who are using their platforms, frankly, to mimic Putin's talking points. And so there's been some confusion. I will say that J.D. Vance, as the vice president, he has been making the case against Ukraine because of the cost on a financial argument, as well as burning through too much of our inventory at the Pentagon that we might need down the road for Taiwan or elsewhere. Mm-hmm. But I think for President Trump, this is a real opportunity for an early win in his administration. There are a lot of conditions that have been set because of the amount of money the Americans have given so far, because of the exhaustion on both sides, because of the stalemate. And so if he plays his card right, the one thing President Trump does not want is a loss or an embarrassment or something. And it would be embarrassing if the U.S. were to just cut and run and Ukraine were to lose and Putin were to win. I think that is going to be a very strong argument for President Trump. And I think the American people can be convinced of supporting Ukraine if it's explained to them. And I think the person to explain to them is President Trump.
Let's get one more call in before the break here. Dan is in York, Pennsylvania. Dan, welcome to The Middle. Go ahead.
Hi there. Thank you for taking my call. Number one, I believe that the Ukraine ought to be supported and continuing support, but something that doesn't come up in much of any of the discussions is why Russia is doing what it's doing. And if you take away the Ukraine and the Crimea, Russia does not have a warm weather port. They are just simply, they've got Murmansk and they've got Vladivostok. They don't have a warm weather port for their Navy without Crimea. That's Sevastopol. And I'm not saying they're right, but we need to understand where they're coming from before any kind of issue can be resolved.
Dan, thank you. Dan Baer, just quickly about that. Is that the reason, do you think? Is that one of the main reasons that Putin wants to have Ukraine?
I don't think it's the main reason. I mean, Crimea is strategic, and so I don't dismiss the strategic value of Crimea. I would point out that Russia was not invaded for the 30 years from the fall of the Soviet Union, the 25 years from the fall of the Soviet Union to the point where it illegally annexed Crimea. It has not suffered an invasion, so the requirement of that port is contentious.
Tolliver, one thing we know, and we talked about this, is that according to the polls, Republicans are far less likely than Democrats to say the U.S. has a responsibility to help Ukraine. 36% for Republicans, 65% for Democrats. That's according to Pew Research.
Yeah, but in Congress, there are members in both parties committed to supporting Ukraine. Here's Republican Representative Michael McCaul on ABC's This Week.
I think President Trump does want to end the war, have a peaceful negotiation. We're all for that. But it's got to be on terms that do not throw Ukraine under the bus. They were thrown under the bus in the Budapest agreements, where they gave up all their nuclear weapons in assurance for security. And guess what happened? There was none. And if there is a deal cut, we have to have teeth in that enforcement agreement such that if Russia ever invades again, there will be consequences.
It's going to be very interesting to see what happens in Washington and the politics of this. Yeah. A reminder, The Middle is available as a podcast in partnership with iHeart Podcasts on the iHeart app or wherever you listen to podcasts. And Tolliver, what are we hearing here?
This is Orange Crush by REM, a song about the chemical agent used during the Vietnam War. There's so many dark songs, obviously, that come out of war, but this one somehow sounds beautiful. More of your calls coming up on The Middle.
This is The Middle. I'm Jeremy Hobson. This hour, we're asking you what should happen now with Ukraine and what's at stake for the United States. You can call us at 844-4MIDDLE. That's 844-464-3353, or you can reach out at listentothemiddle.com. I'm joined by former Ambassador Dan Baer, Director of the Europe Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and Fox News Chief National Security Correspondent Jennifer Griffin. And Jennifer, before we go back to the phones, there was a Chicago Council survey last summer that found most Americans believe that if Russia wins the war, there will be a mass migration of Ukrainians, a military conflict between Russia and NATO, and, as you mentioned earlier, a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. Are those things really being talked about in Washington as potential consequences?
Absolutely. I think if you talk to any of the strategic thinkers, and it's certainly, I think there's going to be some continuity between the last administration. Jake Sullivan met with Mike Waltz, and I think there's an understanding of what's at stake if we get Ukraine wrong. I mean, one thing you've heard from the Trump administration, from President Trump, is that the way we pulled out of Afghanistan then led to Putin invading Ukraine, thinking he could get away with it. Imagine what President Xi will think if Putin is allowed to get away with it. The other thing I want to just mention, one of the last callers talked about the need for a warm water port. You know, if Russia were so concerned about its Navy and having a port, they have lost, the Black Sea Fleet has had 75 warships when this conflict started. They have lost 25 of those ships.
Wow.
from Ukraine, which doesn't have a Navy, used sea drones to take out 25, a full third of their Navy. So wow. They are losing ships. They've lost their port in Syria by allowing Assad to come and take refuge there. They're in big trouble, and I really think we can't underestimate a little bit of more patience. And Putin is the one who's had to turn to North Korea, Iran, mercenaries. He's going to run out of options at some point.
Yeah. Let's go to Isaac, who's in Minneapolis. Isaac, welcome to The Middle. What do you think should happen with Ukraine?
I personally would like to see peace in Ukraine. It's horrible to see how you've had millions of people already, die. They're dead and gone forever. The country has been completely decimated. None of this needed to happen in the first place. If the United States hadn't gotten itself involved, the war probably would have been over in weeks. Unfortunately, we can't turn back the clock, but I think that we should, at this point, face the reality that we should have faced a few years ago, which is that, yes, Putin is a war criminal. What he's done, has been barbaric. But our goal should be peace. unless there's something dramatic to be gained that we can say the cost is worth it. And it's not just the financial cost to the United States. It's the millions of Ukrainians who've already lost their lives, the country that's been destroyed. It's clear from the way the war is going that this has probably been over for a while now. And we should stop taking the side of the Ukrainians in this and be a fair arbiter for peace. And I do think that it's encouraging to hear incoming President Trump say that. And I don't say that as a supporter of his, but it is encouraging to hear.
Well, Isaac, let me just quickly ask you, what do you think about the arguments that we've been hearing all hour that, if you were to do that, it will hurt the U.S. in a number of other ways, including with what President Xi will see as a possible, go ahead to take Taiwan without any consequence?
I think that if President Xi sees it that way, then that's fine as well. We have our own problems here at home. We've got, still rising inequality, poverty far higher than it was before. Child poverty doubled after the pandemic. I think that's why this war has become unpopular among most Americans, and that is confirmed in consistent polling data too. It's not just internet loudmouth, which it also may be.
Isaac, thank you. Let me take that to Dan Baer. Dan Baer, that is a view I'm glad that we got on this program this hour, because there are a lot of people who believe that.
Yeah, I mean, just two things. One, I mean, I think it is really hard to understand why things happening far away actually have an impact on Americans here at home. I get that. And frankly, as the world becomes scarier, there's a totally understandable instinct to say, let's just pull back and shut down our connections with the world and just protect ourselves here at home. Unfortunately, that instinct, while understandable, is almost exactly wrong. In a moment when the world is becoming more complicated and complex, we actually have to engage more. And conflicts like the conflict in Ukraine will not stop in Ukraine. They implicate American interests already. American jobs depend on our relationship with Europe. Europe is a huge trading partner. We need Europe to be safe and secure in order to support our own economy. Certainly, Taiwan is also a huge issue for trade and American prosperity, among other things, as well as security in the region. So I think it is understandable that it's hard to understand why these things that seem far away actually affect us here at home, but they really do. And history shows that when we don't solve them where they are, then we get confronted with them closer to home. The second point I just want to make is that we've heard from several callers about the expense of supporting Ukraine. And I want to put it in context. The spending on Ukraine is less than 10% of the Pentagon overall budget right now. We can actually afford it. And yes, there are other things that we should be spending money on too in this country. I'm not saying that it doesn't come at a cost. But also, I think sometimes when we talk about it, it sounds like we're just delivering bags of cash to the battlefield. And that's not what we're doing. We're delivering largely American-made equipment that is supporting American jobs. By the way, the deal that we would make with the Europeans to expand their defense industrial base and their defense spending would also support American jobs. And so we should remember that this is not a transfer of wealth at the numbers that we're talking about. This is actually stuff that we're making that are supporting people who are willing to fight for their own country, who are doing their own fighting, and who are fighting to defend their democracy.
Jeremy, if I could just pick up on one point about the defense budget. You're talking about, as Dan said, about 10%. And the last caller mentioned that he wouldn't care if China took Taiwan because it's not our problem. I think that is a grave misunderstanding of what Taiwan represents. First of all, if you use a computer, if you use a car, if you use any sort of electronics and you don't just live in the woods off the land with candles, you need the supercomputing chips. If we're going to be competitive in the AI, the next iteration of AI, and really kind of keep our place in the world, you have to have access to those supercomputing chips in Taiwan. And so if you just hand that over to Xi and China, does have an impact back home. And trust me, you think we don't have jobs now in places that have lost jobs? You lose access to Taiwan, and the job market here will crater and society will crater. So we really have to understand how we're connected to the world. These are not just problems out there, and the U.S. is not causing this war in Ukraine. They are trying to help an ally to prevent more bloodshed, frankly.
Let's go to Alice in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Alice, welcome to The Middle. Your thoughts on the future of Ukraine?
I think that if the Ukrainian people want to continue to fight for freedom, for democracy, I think they have every right to do that. And I don't think other countries should be telling them what they should do. And if we have the ability to supply them with what they need to win this war or continue it, I think that's what we should do, because from what I understand, we've always been committed to democracy throughout the world.
Well, I think it's pretty clear, Alice, that the Ukrainians want to fight for freedom because many of them have died doing so. So you think that the U.S. should continue to support them as long as they're willing to fight?
I think if the U.S. can do that, if they have that in their power to do that, I think they should be doing that. I mean, we have always been committed to democracy throughout the world, and I don't see why this should be different.
Mm-hmm. Alice, thank you for that. Let me go to Brian in Birmingham, Alabama. Brian, welcome to The Middle. Go ahead.
Hi, thank you. I believe the U.S. should make a decision to drive towards the end of the war in favor of Ukraine, but really make a hardline decision and then see it through to the end. Do all the necessary steps without all the political wavering back and forth, and just really drive to the end.
Wouldn't that be a nice change? To just stick with something for a while. Brian, great point. Dan Baer, it makes me think of the Iraq War, which went through multiple presidents who had their own ideas of what should happen with that. And of course, the war in Afghanistan, where Donald Trump and his administration negotiated the end, and then Biden had to actually act on it, and then got, of course, a lot of criticism for the very end of the Afghanistan war. But what about that? That makes it does make it very difficult to go on with a long war when the United States changes administrations and changes strategy.
Certainly, the vicissitudes of American politics make executing a sustained national security strategy difficult. But I agree with Brian, and I think, like I said, I want to be optimistic in this moment. What I hear, what I read from General Kellogg, what I hear from the incoming administration makes me cautiously optimistic that what they want to do is identify an end, and that they understand that the way to get to that end is to solve the burden sharing question with the Europeans, to solve the security arrangement for Ukraine post-conflict, and then to show a united front to Putin so that he understands that he's not going to get any more than what he's got. And that this is the end, and that this is the best time to make a deal, and that we will stick to that deal, and we won't see any kind of embarrassing withdrawal or collapse that would damage American credibility for the long run.
Jennifer Griffin, does the Biden administration, did they not want to get to the end of the war in a strong enough way? I mean, we're talking about Trump can come in and he wants to end the war. Doesn't the Biden administration want the war to end as well?
Of course, the Biden administration didn't want this war, and they didn't want it to drag on. The problem is that there was an assessment in the first year or two, and even up until this year, that Putin could use a nuclear weapon. And I think that really slowed down the decision-making, and it was very cautious decision-making about what weapon. On the one hand, they flooded the zone in the very beginning, and they saved Ukraine by providing intelligence and also weaponry up front that helped them really prevent the capital from being taken in those initial days, which many thought was likely to happen. President Trump deserves full credit because, frankly, the Ukrainians could not have fought off those tanks that were heading towards the capital without the Javelin missiles that he had approved at the end of his administration, and those were absolutely crucial in those initial days. So the U.S. both administrations have an interest in Ukraine winning. I think we're at a different inflection point where you can actually talk about coming to a negotiating table. The conditions were not really right up until now. And so, what would be great is if national security in this country wasn't a big, pendulum swing between administrations,
Right.
that there was continuity. And I do believe, as we've said, Jeremy, that there is some continuity of thinking between Keith Kellogg, Mike Waltz, Jake Sullivan. But I do think there is an accelerated time frame right now because we're at a different point in the war.
Yeah. I know they feel the same way about that at NASA, where it takes, decades sometimes to build these rockets. And the new president comes in and says, no, let's do something else now with that. Let's go to Jared, who's in Houston, Texas. Jared, welcome to The Middle. Go ahead.
Hey, how's it going? Yeah, I think it's been a lot of really interesting viewpoints so far. I'm confused, honestly, by a couple callers. It makes me feel like I'm taking crazy pills or something, because some of the responses seem to suggest that we should kind of just give up and leave Ukraine to their own devices. And I just can't imagine pairing that mentality with World War II and fighting the Nazis. And I mean, if your opinion is that we shouldn't have gotten involved in World War II, then fine, at least you're consistent ideologically. But I don't know. It feels like an un-American take to just be like, we should abandon Ukraine and let Putin do what he wants, keep the territory that he wants, and just sue for peace.
Let me ask you just quickly, Jared, what did you think about, for example, Afghanistan, where we were trying to set up a democracy there? Obviously, that didn't work in the end. But what did you feel the same way there?
Yeah, I mean, I think the Middle East has its own sort of problems. There definitely is some overlap. I thought the way that the withdrawal happened was terrible. I think both the Trump and the Biden administration bear some blame for that. Obviously, it was the terms were negotiated during Trump's term and by his team and him. But Biden definitely shares some blame for how it went down too, and it was an unacceptable result for sure.
Yeah. Jared, thank you. Dan Baer, let's focus on that issue of just it's un-American, Jared says, to not support Ukraine, another fellow democracy in trouble.
I think that's true, and it speaks to me. Although I would say that for people who aren't inspired by the kind of values argument that the world will be more peaceful if we look out for the human rights and fundamental dignity of people around the world, and that when a brutal dictator invades a neighboring country that is a rising democracy, that we should care about that because we care about democracy. We should also care about that because it is really, really bad for American prosperity and security, and because it might actually hurt Americans and hurt American jobs and American security over the long run. And so there are two sets of reasons that are both compelling. And if you aren't persuaded by the values argument, I would still make the security prosperity argument just as forcefully.
Jennifer Griffin, I'm going to give you the last word and ask you this. This is just one of many issues that you cover in terms of national security. We just had a major attack in New Orleans by an ISIS convert. How important is Ukraine to Trump as he comes in terms of all the national security issues that are on his plate?
Well, I don't envy him, and I don't envy any president to have to take on the number of problems right now. And so the question is, which two or three is he going to focus on first? And he has made Ukraine a priority. So I think you'll see that as one of the priorities. But I think, look what's happening tomorrow in Venezuela. You have a decision point with this next administration. Are you going to support the Maduro regime, or are you going to support Edmundo Gonzalez, who actually won the election there? Venezuela is very important to national security for the United States. If you want to have millions of Venezuelans go back to Venezuela and not flood the border and come across into the United States, you need to solve the Venezuela problem. And then Venezuela also is an energy source. So that's another issue right on our doorstep. You have the China issue, you have Taiwan, you have what's going to happen in Syria, what's going to happen between Iran and Israel. This is going to be an incredibly complicated period, a matrix like you've never seen in terms of national security challenges. And I hope that the strength of this administration coming in and this president who does know how to be strong and present strength, I hope that he'll use it as a force for good and not as a force for isolationism.
Well, I want to thank my guests, Fox News Chief National Security Correspondent Jennifer Griffin and Dan Baer, Senior Vice President for Policy Research and Director of the Europe Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Thanks so much to both of you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And next week, right before Inauguration Day, we're going to be asking whether or not democracy is really at risk in Trump's second term. We're going to be joined by political commentator Andrew Sullivan and Clemson University history professor Vernon Burton.
As always, you can call in at 8444-MIDDLE. That's 844-464-3353. Or you can reach out at listentothemiddle.com, or you can also sign up for our free weekly newsletter. And don't forget to check out our new video podcast on YouTube, where you can watch us as well as hear us.
We look great, Tolliver. We look great.
We sure do.
The Middle is brought to you by Long Neck Media, distributed by Illinois Public Media in Urbana, Illinois, and produced by Harrison Patino, Danny Alexander, Sam Burmis-Dawes, John Barth, Annika Deschler, and Brandon Kondritz. Our technical director is Jason Croft. Thanks to our satellite radio listeners, our podcast audience, and the more than 420 public radio stations that are making it possible for people across the country to listen to The Middle. I'm Jeremy Hobson, and I will talk to you next week.